They say grief doesn't knock when it enters. It barges in, loud and unwelcome, changing everything in an instant. Nathaniel Cross stood at the center of St. Clair's Children's Hospital, his voice ringing through the polished hallway like a slap. "That's enough," he said, sharp and cold. The sound froze every nurse and startled the few visitors nearby. Just seconds earlier, his son Max had been laughing, really laughing, as a young nurse spun his wheelchair in slow, playful circles. But now, silence fell heavy over everything. Max lowered his arms. His little hands gripped the edge of his seat. The joy in his eyes dimmed like a switch flipped off too soon. The nurse, Emily Hart, stood still, her hands paused in midair, her smile gently fading. Her brown hair had slipped from behind her ear during the twirl, but she didn't move to fix it. She only looked at Max, quietly heartbroken, as Nathaniel approached with heavy, deliberate steps. He didn't say another word. He placed his hands on the back of Max's chair, gave Emily a glance so cold it made her step back, and pushed the boy away without even acknowledging what had just happened. The hallway emptied of its brief magic. All that remained was the echo of a laugh that had dared to exist. Emily stood in place, her heart pounding. Around her, the hospital moved on. Nurses resumed their tasks. A doctor passed by, glancing at her with raised brows but saying nothing. No one dared to question Nathaniel Cross. He wasn't just any parent. He was the Cross in Cross Industries, tech magnate, hotel owner, billionaire, a man with more power than time, but none of that mattered to her now. Max had laughed, and not just a polite, quiet chuckle. It had been full, deep and bright, bursting out of him like it had been waiting inside for far too long. It had filled the corridor with something the walls hadn't heard in a long time. Joy without weight, joy that needed no permission. Nathaniel didn't speak as he wheeled Max toward the elevator. He kept his eyes forward, face unreadable. Max sat still, shrinking into himself, the corners of his mouth pulled down like they knew not to hope too much. When the elevator opened, they entered without a word. Nathaniel stood behind him, arms crossed. Max stared at the floor. To anyone watching, the man looked unshaken. But Emily had seen something just before the laugh was cut short. A flicker in Nathaniel's expression, almost like a crack forming in a wall. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper, fear, pain, something he couldn't name or face. Just hours earlier, the day had begun like every other Friday. At exactly 9 a.m., Nathaniel had arrived at the hospital with Max, escorted by 2 security guards and his assistant, who clutched a digital tablet and rattled off reminders about meetings. Nathaniel responded with clipped answers and distracted nods. He had long since mastered the art of being present without really being there. Max was scheduled for a routine checkup with Dr. Santiago, his neurologist. The boy had been in that hospital too many times to count. Ever since the accident a year ago, the hospital had become an extension of his world. Cold walls, white coats, endless waiting. Nathaniel sat outside the exam room as usual, eyes fixed. On his phone, managing his empire from the palm of his hand. He didn't notice when Emily passed by the first time. She paused briefly, watching Max from a distance. She had seen the boy before, quiet, observant, moving through the halls like a ghost. Always with his father, always silent. Emily wasn't supposed to get involved. Nurses weren't assigned to be emotional anchors, just caretakers. But something about Max made her stop. She crouched beside him, gently bringing herself to his eye level. Her voice was soft, light. "Hey," she said. "You look like someone who knows where treasure is hidden." Max blinked, unsure. Emily leaned closer and whispered, "I heard there's a secret map hidden in one of these paintings. They say only the bravest kids can find it." A flicker of curiosity lit up Max's eyes. "I could use a partner," she added. "Want to help me find it?" He hesitated, then nodded once, just barely. But it was enough. Emily rose to her feet and placed her hands on the back of his chair. She didn't ask for permission. She moved slowly, gently, spinning him once in a circle, then again, her voice humming a soft melody. The hall became a ballroom. The paintings became windows to other worlds. Max's face brightened. He laughed. The sound was sudden, bright, and real. A laugh from deep in his chest, the kind children are supposed to have every day, but sometimes forget how to make. Emily twirled the chair once more. Then the shout came. The word that shattered it all. Nathaniel's voice brought everything back into focus. The hospital, the rules, the weight of things unsaid. Emily stepped away. Max stopped laughing. The music, imagined or not, was gone. Nathaniel didn't yell again. He didn't need to. His face said everything. His silence was thunder. Emily wanted to speak, to explain, to say that the boy had smiled, had felt something. But words caught in her throat. She watched as they disappeared around the corner. In the car, Nathaniel drove in silence. Max looked out the window, tracing the fog on the glass with his finger. Nathaniel's grip on the wheel tightened with every red light. The laughter echoed in his memory, looping like a song he didn't want to hear. At home, Nathaniel stood outside Max's bedroom door. He didn't open it. He just stared at the wood, as if trying to see through it. Inside, Max had already curled. Under his covers, stuffed animals lined the shelf beside him. Photographs hung on the walls, pictures from a time before the accident, before everything broke. One showed them at the beach, Max running with a kite, Nathaniel laughing behind him, shirt untucked and barefoot in the sand. He hadn't laughed like that since. Nathaniel reached for the doorknob, then stopped. His hand hovered in the air, then slowly fell. He exhaled, steady and low. "I'm sorry," he whispered, barely louder than the wind outside the window. He turned and walked away. He didn't know that Max, still half awake, had heard him, and somewhere else in the city, Emily sat in the hospital break room, her thoughts circling like the wheels of that boy's chair. She didn't know what would come of it. She only knew that for a moment, a child who hadn't laughed in months had remembered how, and that meant something. Nathaniel Cross hadn't always been a fortress. Once, not long ago, he was known for his charm as much as his ambition. Photos of him smiling beside his son used to light up glossy magazines. The tech world admired him. Investors chased his shadow, and parenting blogs wrote about how he brought Max to meetings just to keep him close. Back then, his laugh was real, his hands steady. His life felt like progress, forward motion, unstoppable. But that version of Nathaniel had died in a moment he could never rewind. It had been raining that day, the kind of thin, silent rain that coats the roads in danger. He should have cancelled the call. He should have pulled over. But he didn't. The investor on the other end was impatient. The deal couldn't wait. Max was in the back seat, humming quietly to himself, clutching a small plastic dinosaur. Nathaniel hadn't even looked in the rearview mirror when the truck appeared. 1 second the road was clear. The next, it was all metal and glass and screaming. Nathaniel walked away without a scratch. But Max never walked again. Doctors told him it was a miracle the boy had survived. A miracle. Nathaniel remembered hearing the word and wondering how something could be both a miracle and a sentence. He stayed at the hospital every day for 2 weeks after the accident. He watched Max sleep, watched tubes and machines do what his own arms could not. He promised himself he'd make it right. But when Max opened his eyes and asked, barely audible, "Why can't I move my legs?" something broke inside Nathaniel. He didn't answer. He couldn't, so he turned to the one thing that never demanded emotions: work. His company grew faster than ever. The projects multiplied. He bought a new hotel chain, acquired 3 startups in a single quarter. He was everywhere except beside his son. Because every time he saw Max in that chair, something inside him whispered, "This is your fault." And Nathaniel, a man who conquered markets and silenced rivals with a glance, had no idea how to silence the voice in his own head. So he didn't try. He distanced himself. He created schedules, layers of staff, and buffers of silence between him and what he couldn't face. He still visited the hospital. He still paid for the best doctors. But he no longer knew how to be a father. He only knew how to function. Max, quiet and obedient, never asked for more. But Nathaniel saw it, the weight in his eyes, the slow way he moved, the absence of questions, of excitement, of life. And still, he did nothing. He convinced himself that presence was enough, that money was love, that showing up with a phone in one hand and a frown on his face was some kind of parenting. Until that hallway. Until the nurse with the warm eyes and the nerve to treat Max like a child and not a diagnosis. Her name, Emily, was printed on her badge in simple letters. He hadn't noticed it at first. He barely looked at her face. He only saw the way Max smiled when she touched the wheelchair, the way he laughed as she spun him. And in that moment, it was as if Max had become someone else, or perhaps become himself again. And Nathaniel hated it, not because Max was happy, but because Nathaniel wasn't the one who made him feel that way. That night, Nathaniel stood in the living room of their penthouse apartment, watching the skyline flicker against the glass. Max had gone to bed hours ago. The room was quiet, yet Nathaniel's mind roared. He thought about the paintings in the hospital hallway, the ones Emily had told Max were treasure maps. He thought about her voice, the way she knelt down, the way she saw Max, not as a burden, but as a boy. And he hated her for that, or maybe he envied her. He didn't know which was worse. The following morning, Nathaniel moved through his routine like a machine. Coffee, calls, contracts, numbers, percentages, control. Everything made sense in the world of logic and outcomes. But around 11, he opened a drawer in his office and pulled out a photo frame. It had been hidden for months. In it, Max stood barefoot on the grass, arms spread wide, laughing with wild abandon. Nathaniel was behind him, caught mid-laugh. He remembered that day, remembered lifting Max onto his shoulders and pretending they could fly. He set the photo on the desk, then pushed it away, then pulled it back. Something inside him itched, something restless. Later that evening, as he sat beside Max at dinner, he noticed the boy pushing mashed potatoes around his plate with a fork, not eating. The silence between them had become so normal, it almost didn't feel like silence anymore. Nathaniel cleared his throat. His voice, when it came, was rough with disuse. "Did you like how the nurse treated you yesterday?" Max blinked, startled. He hadn't expected his father to speak. After a pause, he nodded. "Yeah," he said. "She was funny." Nathaniel stared at him. "You laughed." Max looked down, smiling faintly. "I guess I did." And just like that, the itch inside Nathaniel grew stronger. It felt dangerous, like something he couldn't control, something he might need to follow. The next week, when Max's hospital appointment appeared on the calendar, Nathaniel did something unexpected. He turned to his assistant and said, "Make sure the same nurse is with him." "The one from last time?" She raised an eyebrow, surprised, but nodded. When they arrived at the hospital, Emily was already there, waiting at the entrance to the exam wing. She didn't mention what had happened. She didn't apologize. She didn't act like she expected anything. She simply smiled at Max, crouched again to his level and said, "Treasure hunt's still on." Nathaniel watched from a few feet away. Max's eyes lit up, and something inside the man of stone began to stir. Emily Hart had never liked following the rules just for the sake of it. Protocols had their place, of course, but when she looked at children like Max Cross, she didn't see a chart number or a case file. She saw a person, a small, quiet boy with eyes too old for his age, who didn't just need medicine, he needed to feel alive again. The first time she saw Max had been weeks before the hallway incident. He was in the waiting room, motionless, surrounded by blinking monitors and distant chatter. His father stood behind him, phone in hand, looking every bit the legend the news made him out to be. Sharp suit, cold eyes, impeccable control. Most people stared at Nathaniel. Emily stared at the boy. There was a loneliness about Max that went beyond the chair. It was in the way he didn't meet anyone's eyes, the way his shoulders curled in on themselves, the way his mouth stayed still when other children, even sick ones, still found ways to laugh. Emily didn't know the full story back then, but she didn't need to. It was enough to see a child quietly vanishing into himself, right there in the middle of a crowded hospital. So she started saying hello whenever they crossed paths. Nothing more, just a smile, a few words, and every time she got the same soft nod, the same silence, until that day in the hallway. She hadn't planned it. She didn't think twice. She saw the boy sitting alone, his father scrolling through something urgent, and the moment pulled her in like a current. She'd always believed that children remember how you make them feel far more than what you do, so she crouched, smiled, and invited him into a story. She hadn't expected him to respond. When he laughed, her heart had surged. And when Nathaniel's voice shut it down, part of her wanted to apologize, but a louder part refused. She didn't regret it, not for a second. When she was assigned to accompany Max again, a week later, she prepared herself for tension. Nathaniel Cross had the kind of reputation that made even senior doctors nervous. The fact that he had requested her presence personally only made the situation more curious. She met them at the entrance with her usual calm smile. Max looked surprised. His eyebrows lifted for a second before softening into something close to joy. She greeted him like an old friend. Nathaniel said nothing. He nodded once, curtly. But he didn't stop her. As they walked down the hallway, Emily didn't tell jokes or spin his chair this time. She knew when to push and when to pause, but her presence beside Max was steady, soft. She explained each part of the visit like a game instead of a chore. She made the machines sound like secret agents and the medical forms like puzzles. She noticed how Max began to lean toward her ever so slightly, how he asked small questions, how he looked up more often, and she noticed Nathaniel too. He stood closer this time, didn't check his phone as much. He listened, she realized, even if he pretended not to. Inside the exam room, when Dr. Santiago began explaining a new procedure, Emily watched Max's hands fidget in his lap. She sat beside him and gently placed her hand over his. "Don't worry," she whispered. "I'll show you a trick to be brave afterward." Max smiled nervously. Nathaniel, standing in the corner, crossed his arms, but didn't object. After the appointment, they returned to the hallway. Emily moved slowly, careful not to overstep. But just before they reached the elevator, Max looked up at her. "Is there really treasure in the paintings?" he asked. She grinned. "You'd be surprised." Nathaniel exhaled softly, as if letting go of breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Later that night, Emily found herself thinking about the boy with the quiet smile and the man who looked like he hadn't smiled in years. She didn't know what it was exactly, but something about that family stayed with her in a way most cases didn't. Nathaniel Cross wasn't the first distant parent she'd encountered, but he was perhaps the most unreadable. Cold, yes, but not hollow. Something in his eyes betrayed a story far messier than his spotless reputation. And Max was beginning to unfold, not all at once, but in the smallest of ways that mattered most. The next time Emily saw them, Nathaniel surprised her. Instead of standing back, he remained nearby as she spoke to Max. He didn't interrupt. He didn't frown. He watched, closely, as if trying to learn the secret to something he'd once known but forgotten. That day, in the therapy room, Emily made up a game with Max involving animal sounds. Every time she guessed wrong, on purpose, he giggled. Nathaniel watched from a nearby chair, arms still crossed, but his posture had softened, just a little. At one point, Max turned to his father. "Dad," he said, "do you want to try?" Nathaniel blinked. He hadn't been asked to join in anything in months. He hesitated. Emily looked at him, open and without judgment, and then, to everyone's surprise, including his own, he stood and walked over. "I guess I can try once," he said. It was awkward at first. His guesses were stiff, his tone uncertain, but Max laughed anyway. He laughed because his father was trying, and that meant more than any answer could. Emily didn't say a word. She just smiled, held the moment gently, and let it be what it was. Afterward, Nathaniel stayed a little longer in the room than he needed to. He didn't rush out. He didn't check his phone. He simply watched Max, a trace of something new flickering behind his eyes. That night, as Emily walked home under the quiet city sky, she realized something had changed. She didn't know where it was all going, but she knew that laughter, once silenced in a hallway, had found its way back into the boy's life. And maybe, just maybe, it was beginning to echo into the man's life too. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, at least not according to Nathaniel Cross. His life had always been about control, measured steps, calculated outcomes. Every detail of his existence, from the cufflinks on his sleeves to the punctuation in his emails, was curated. Control made sense. Control was safe, but Emily Hart wasn't part of any plan, and yet here she was, again, walking beside Max through the hospital corridor, her voice calm, her steps in rhythm with the slow glide of his wheelchair. She didn't speak loudly, didn't tell any stories this time, but even in her silence, she carried warmth. Nathaniel followed just a few feet behind. He didn't understand why he hadn't stopped this, or why, the week before, he had told his assistant to ensure Emily would be available again. The justification had been simple enough. Max seemed more at ease with her, but even as he said it, he knew it wasn't the whole truth. The real reason was more complicated. He couldn't stop thinking about her, not in a romantic way, not exactly, not yet, but in the way a drowning man notices someone who can swim. It unsettled him. It also pulled at something he hadn't felt in years. They arrived at the therapy room early. Emily helped Max adjust his seating, while Nathaniel stood near the door, hands in his pockets, trying to act like he wasn't paying attention. But he was. The therapist hadn't arrived yet, so Emily knelt beside Max and pulled a small notepad from her pocket. "Want to try something while we wait?" she asked. Max nodded, smiling. She opened to a blank page and drew a crude stick figure. "This is Agent Max," she whispered. "Secret mission. Guess the object I'm thinking of. I'll give you 3 clues." Max grinned and nodded again. They played quietly, Emily leaning in just enough to make the game feel conspiratorial. With every guess, Max laughed. Sometimes out of joy, sometimes just from watching her pretend to be baffled by her own clues. Nathaniel watched it all unfold from across the room. For a long time he didn't move. Then finally, Max looked up from the game and turned to him. "Dad," he said, "you can play too." Emily paused, eyes flicking toward Nathaniel with curiosity but no pressure. Just an open door. Nathaniel hesitated. His instinct was to say no. He had meetings, messages, important things, but none of them seemed urgent right now. He walked forward slowly and knelt beside the chair. "All right," he said. "1 round." Emily handed him the notepad. He looked at it, then at Max. "Okay," he said. "I'm thinking of something green." Max leaned forward eagerly. "A frog?" "Close." Emily smiled as the two continued. She didn't need to join in this time. She simply watched as father and son, for the first time in over a year, leaned toward each other instead of away. After the appointment, Emily walked them back toward the elevator. As always, she crouched to Max's level, told him he'd done great, and made a joke about training for the World Guessing Championships. Max giggled. But this time, as she stood up, Nathaniel didn't walk away immediately. "Thank you," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Emily tilted her head. "For what?" He hesitated. "For talking to him like he's still a kid." She smiled, soft and honest. "He is still a kid." Nathaniel didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked at Max, really looked, and then nodded, almost to himself. They left the hospital together, a few steps closer than they had arrived. That night, Nathaniel didn't go straight to his office after dinner. Instead, he cleared the table with Max, slowly, clumsily. The silence between them wasn't filled with conversation yet, but it wasn't empty either. There was something new there, something neither of them had words for. Afterward, Nathaniel sat in his room with his laptop open and unread emails filling the screen, but instead of answering them, he stared at a photo of Max that had long since been buried in a folder labeled "Before." In the image, Max wore a pirate costume. His arms were stretched out like wings. Nathaniel stood beside him with a ridiculous foam sword in hand, both of them mid-laugh. He remembered that day. It had been Max's 7th birthday, just weeks before the crash. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, the laughter still echoing in his mind. Not from the photo, but from that morning in the therapy room. The sound was the same, just older now, a little more cautious, but alive. He closed the laptop without replying to a single message. The next week, Max had another appointment. When Emily met them at the hospital entrance, there was something different about the way Nathaniel greeted her. It wasn't warm, exactly, but it was no longer guarded. He nodded with intention. Emily smiled back, but said nothing. As they walked, Max began pointing to the paintings again, asking about the secret treasure. Emily answered with mock-serious clues, inventing a whole underground network of mystery and adventure. Nathaniel listened from behind. He didn't interrupt, didn't rush. By the time they reached the waiting area, Max was beaming. Emily pulled a small sticker from her bag, a shiny gold star, and placed it gently on the armrest of his chair. "For bravery," she said, "and excellent detective work." Nathaniel watched Max trace the sticker with his finger. Emily straightened. "You don't mind, do you?" she asked him, not sarcastically, but sincerely. He shook his head. "No," he said. "I don't." After the session, as they waited for paperwork, Max looked up again. "Dad," he asked, "do you think someday we could go find real treasure?" Nathaniel paused. He could have laughed it off, could have said something about being too busy, but he looked at Max, really looked, and something inside him gave way. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think we could." And just like that, something fractured. Thin crack in the surface of a man who had built his whole life around not feeling too much. It wasn't a breakdown, it wasn't a breakthrough, but it was the first real sign that Nathaniel Cross might not be made of stone after all. The moment didn't feel planned. It didn't feel like a decision. It felt like gravity, silent, sure, and impossible to resist. They had just finished another round of tests. Max had been quiet during the scans, eyes closed, fingers tapping against his pant leg in a rhythm only he could hear. Nathaniel stayed nearby, barely speaking, his hands resting on his knees, his mind wandering through places he didn't dare speak aloud. When it was over, Max looked pale and tired, but he didn't complain. He never did. He simply waited to be wheeled back through the hallways toward the same set of double doors that marked the edge of what had once been normal life. Emily was waiting outside. She gave Max a small wave and crouched beside him as if they were continuing a secret mission, already in progress. Her presence was quiet today, grounded, more anchor than spark. She could feel the heaviness in the air, the weight of tests, of memory, of a boy growing older inside a body that had refused to move since that one unspeakable day. She didn't offer a game this time. Instead, she hummed, a low, gentle melody. Familiar but wordless, the kind that settled in the chest without permission. Max looked up. His lips curved slightly. "I remember that song," he said. Emily smiled. "Of course you do. It's the one we danced to." And then, without thinking, without asking, she placed her hands gently on the wheelchair handles and began to move. Not fast, not with flair, just slowly, softly, turning the chair with care, matching the hum, letting the corridor around them melt into something else. Max laughed. It started small, like a hiccup, and then opened up into something fuller, freer, a sound that hadn't been heard in weeks, maybe months. Nathaniel stood just a few paces behind, frozen. The laugh hit him like a wind to the chest. He didn't move at first, just watched, his face unreadable, and then, as if propelled by something outside himself, he stepped forward. "Enough." He whispered at first, but no one heard. He tried again, louder. "Emily." She stopped spinning. Max's laughter faded into stillness. Nathaniel approached slowly. His eyes burned, not with anger, but something deeper. His voice came sharp. "What are you doing?" Emily didn't flinch, letting him feel free for 30 seconds. "This is a hospital, not a—" He stopped, his words catching. "A what?" she asked, calm. "A prison?" He didn't answer. She turned to face him fully. "You think I'm overstepping? I get that. But if you'd seen what I've seen day after day, if you'd seen how many kids never laugh, never look up, never feel anything again," she paused, "then you'd understand why I gave him this moment." Nathaniel glanced at Max. The boy's eyes were still shining. He hadn't stopped smiling. Yet he was holding on to the feeling like it might slip away. "I'm doing what you won't," Emily added gently. "I'm showing him life isn't just doctors and machines." Nathaniel looked back at her, and for a long second, neither of them spoke. Finally, he turned to Max and gripped the wheelchair handles. "Let's go," he said. Max lowered his eyes. "Okay." Emily stepped aside. Nathaniel pushed the chair toward the elevator. The wheels squeaked quietly over the tile floor. The melody had stopped. The moment had passed, but it didn't leave. That night, Nathaniel didn't speak during the car ride home. He didn't check his phone, didn't answer calls. His mind replayed every second of that hallway. The laugh, the spin, Emily's words. He was angry, but not at her. He was angry at how right she might be. He had promised himself he was doing what was best. He had promised that distance would protect them both. But what if the distance was the very thing hurting Max the most? After dinner, he lingered in the kitchen while Max wheeled himself down the hall. The boy moved slowly, more tired than usual. Nathaniel poured a glass of water but didn't drink it. Instead, he walked to the hallway and stood by Max's bedroom door. He knocked softly. "Come in," came the small voice. Nathaniel stepped inside. Max was already under the covers, his room lit only by a small reading lamp near the bed. "You okay?" Nathaniel asked, unsure what else to say. Max shrugged. "Just tired." Nathaniel sat on the edge of the bed. The silence between them stretched. "I saw you smiling today," he said. "With Emily." Max nodded. "She's nice." "She is," Nathaniel admitted. There was a pause. Max looked up at him. "Dad, do you think one day you'd want to dance with me?" The question hit him like a punch. He swallowed hard. "What?" "I mean like she did," Max said. "You could push the chair and we could just pretend, like a real dance." Nathaniel looked at his son. He saw the hesitation in his eyes. the hope trying not to be too loud. He wanted to say no, to make an excuse, to remind him of the hospital rules or say something about time, but none of that mattered. Nathaniel exhaled slowly and stood. Without a word, he walked to the back of the wheelchair, gripped the handles, and turned it gently to face the open space. "Near the foot of the bed? Let's try it," he said. Max looked stunned. "Now?" Nathaniel nodded. "Now." He began to move slowly, carefully, unsure of what he was doing. He followed the invisible rhythm from earlier, moving the chair. In a wide, clumsy arc, Max laughed again. "Left, Dad?" "Turn left, like we're spinning." Nathaniel turned, this time with a little more flair. His shoes shuffled on the rug. Max raised his arms like a performer at the end of a show. They danced, not well, not long, but enough for Max to laugh. Like a child again, enough for Nathaniel to remember what it felt like to be more than a man filled with guilt. They stopped after a few turns. Max looked up, breathless. "That was awesome." Nathaniel smiled. "Yeah," he said, "it was." He tucked the blankets around Max and turned off the lamp. At the door he paused. "Good night," he said. "Night, Dad." As Nathaniel walked back down the hall, his hand still tingled from the moment. His chest felt lighter. The echo of Max's laughter filled the silence he used to keep so carefully guarded. The next morning he called his assistant and cleared his schedule. He didn't explain why, but she didn't ask. The hallway was quieter than usual. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above, casting a cool glow on the tiled floor. Outside room 214, the world was still, except for the occasional passing footsteps of nurses, the muffled beeps from monitors, and the soft rustling of papers being filed behind the nurses' station. Inside that room, Max was asleep. It had been a long day. The doctors had ordered extra scans after some unusual nerve responses during therapy. Nothing alarming, they said, just caution. He'd be under observation for the night. Nathaniel had stayed, pacing for a while, then sitting, then pacing again. The hours passed, and eventually Emily found him in the hallway, standing by the window with his hands in his pockets, his eyes somewhere far beyond the city lights. She approached, slowly. He didn't turn. "He's okay," she said. "Stable. Just tired?" He nodded once. They stood in silence for a moment. It wasn't awkward, though it might have been weeks ago. Not now. Not after everything. "He doesn't usually sleep that easily," Nathaniel murmured. "Used to need music or stories." "You used to tell them?" He nodded again. Emily leaned against the wall a few feet away from him. "Max adores you." "You know?" Nathaniel looked down at the floor. "He shouldn't." "Why not?" He hesitated. "Because I'm the reason he's in that chair." The words were spoken so simply, so plainly, it felt like they had been waiting inside him forever. He didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He just said it. Emily's eyes softened, but she didn't rush to respond. She let the silence hold for a moment longer. "I was driving," he continued. "I answered a call I shouldn't have. I was distracted. That truck, it came out of nowhere. They told me it wasn't my fault, but it was. It always will be." Emily shifted slightly, but still didn't interrupt. "He cried the first few nights," Nathaniel said, voice tight, "not because of the pain, but because he didn't understand. He kept asking when he could walk again, and I didn't know how to tell him he never would." He rubbed a hand over his face. "So I stopped trying. I buried myself in work, told myself I was doing it for him, for his future. But really, I couldn't face what I did." Emily stepped closer now. "You didn't stop loving him," she said gently. "No," Nathaniel said, "but I made him feel like I did. That's just as bad, isn't it?" Her eyes shimmered, but she held her voice steady. "He doesn't think that," she said. "Not even a little. He's just been waiting for you to come back." Nathaniel looked at her now, really looked. I don't know how to be what he needs. Emily shook her head. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to fix everything. You just have to show up like you did today and yesterday and the day before that. He exhaled slowly, his posture softening. I thought if I stayed away I wouldn't make it worse, he said. But staying away was the worst part, Emily said. Nathaniel lowered his head, eyes closing briefly. I feel like I've failed him every single day since the crash. She moved closer. Then stop failing him tomorrow. That sentence landed in his chest like truth dropped in water. It rippled. You don't understand, he whispered. I do, she replied. He glanced up. Not your guilt, she added. That's yours. But I understand what it means to want to undo something you never can. Nathaniel tilted his head, curious. Emily hesitated. My brother, she said. He had leukemia. I was 16. I missed his last Christmas because I was mad at him over something stupid. I don't even remember what. I told myself I'd make it up to him later, but later never came. She looked away. You carry it. With you, she said. That moment, that choice. But you learn eventually that loving someone means trying again. Not perfectly, just honestly. Nathaniel leaned against the wall now, standing beside her, shoulder to shoulder. I don't think I've been honest with anyone in years, he said. You just were, Emily replied. He nodded slowly. They stood, like that for a while. Neither needed to speak. The quiet between them was no longer distance, it was understanding. Minutes passed. Then Nathaniel broke the silence. Can I ask you something? Of course. Why do you care so much? She looked at him, not defensive, not surprised, because I've seen too many kids grow up thinking they're alone, and too many parents believing they've already lost their chance. Her voice didn't shake, but it was full of weight. And maybe, she added, because I've been alone too. And it doesn't have to stay that way. Nathaniel nodded. Again, he looked toward the room where Max slept. He asked me to dance yesterday, he said. Emily's lips lifted slightly. And? I did. She looked at him, eyes bright. How'd it go? Terrible, he said. I stepped on his rug and nearly tripped. She laughed softly. But he smiled, Nathaniel added. He called it the best dance ever. That's all that matters. Nathaniel looked at her again, a faint trace of something new in his eyes, maybe gratitude, maybe something deeper. Emily, he said. Yes? Thank you. She nodded once. You're welcome. As the hallway lights dimmed to their nighttime setting and the hospital quieted further, the two of them stood side by side, not as nurse and father, not as symbols of duty and guilt, but simply as two people learning how to hold space for someone else's pain. And in that space, something shifted. Not everything. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to make room for hope. The world didn't shift all at once. There were no grand announcements, no music swells, no sudden sunshine breaking through clouds, but something had changed. Nathaniel Cross no longer waited outside the therapy rooms. He no longer checked his phone while Max stretched his arms or balanced with help from the parallel bars. He no longer treated the hospital like an obligation. He began showing up, not just physically, but fully. Each week brought something new, small things, quiet things, the kind of details most people would miss. He started arriving early. He asked questions, not just to the doctors, but to Max. What the exercises were for, what they were working on, what it felt like when he tried to move his toes. He celebrated every small improvement as if it were a championship win. A 10-second balance became a standing ovation. A flicker of sensation in Max's legs turned into cautious, hopeful silence. Then, a smile that stayed for hours. Max, in turn, bloomed. He no longer waited silently in the chair. He talked. He made jokes. He asked Emily questions. He started humming during long scans and made up names for the machines. And when Emily came into the room, his whole face lit up. So did Nathaniel's, though he tried not to show it. Their interactions grew more frequent. The walls that once stood between them had thinned, then crumbled. They began to talk even after Max had gone in for tests. At first about practical things, medication schedules, therapy reports, but over time, the conversations drifted. They talked about the city, about music, about books they remembered from childhood. Emily told stories from her nursing school days, most of them ending in embarrassment or laughter. Nathaniel listened. Then, little by little, he began to share too. He told her about his early career, about how he started with nothing but a laptop and a rented desk, how he worked out of coffee shops until investors noticed him, how he never took a day off, not even when Max was born. "I thought success would make everything easier," he admitted once. "Turns out, it just makes your failures harder to face." Emily had looked at him then, not with pity, but with understanding. He hadn't expected her to understand, but she always did. It became normal to see them together. Emily at Max's side, Nathaniel a few steps away, then closer, then beside them both. The staff noticed, the therapist noticed, Max noticed, and no one said a word, because whatever it was that was unfolding between them, it was good. One afternoon, as they waited for the results of Max's latest scan, Emily sat beside him in the waiting room, while Nathaniel stood near the window. The sky outside was grey, the kind of grey that looked permanent. Max seemed anxious, his hands fidgeted, his eyes kept flicking toward his father. Emily noticed instantly. She leaned in. "Something on your mind?" Max hesitated, then whispered, "Do you think my dad would ever dance with me again?" Emily glanced toward the window. Nathaniel stood with his arms crossed, gaze fixed on something distant. "I think," she said slowly, "you should ask him." Max stared at her. "Now?" She grinned. "Why not?" He looked doubtful, but then he turned his chair toward his father and wheeled forward slowly. "Dad?" he said. Nathaniel turned, surprised. "Yeah, bud?" Max swallowed. "Would you dance with us?" "Me and Emily." Nathaniel blinked. The words hit harder than he expected. He looked at Emily, who raised her eyebrows as if to say, "Your move." It was ridiculous, childish, absurd even. They were in a hospital waiting room, for God's sake, and yet Nathaniel stepped forward. He placed his hands on the back of Max's chair. "Let's do it," he said. Emily stood, her smile blooming into something brighter. She began to hum. Again, the same melody from that first hallway dance, a soft rhythm, slow and steady. Nathaniel began to move the chair, not spinning wildly, just swaying left and right, guiding Max in a gentle arc. Emily circled them, arms out, pretending to curtsy. Max laughed. Other patients and nurses paused. Some smiled. A few wiped away tears. For a moment, the hospital was not a hospital. It was a ballroom, a stage, a dream. Nathaniel turned the chair one more time and caught himself smiling, not politely, not for anyone else, but truly. They stopped only when Max's cheeks hurt from laughing. "Best dance yet," Max whispered. Nathaniel nodded. "Agreed." They didn't speak much on the way home that evening, but something in the air between them was different, softer, warmer. That night, after Max had gone to sleep, Nathaniel found himself lingering in the hallway, where light spilled from the kitchen and quiet surrounded the rest of the home. Emily's number was saved in his phone now. He had never used it. He stared at it for a long time. Then finally he typed, "I owe you dinner, as a thank you, if you're free." He stared at the message for longer than he wanted to admit, then hit send. He didn't expect her to reply immediately, but she did. "You don't owe me anything, but I'd love that." The next evening, they met outside a small bistro on the quieter side of town. Nothing expensive, nothing flashy. Emily arrived in a navy dress and sneakers, her hair loosely pinned, a quiet confidence in her step. Nathaniel, in his usual suit, looked almost out of place, until he smiled. They talked over pasta and soft jazz music. They didn't talk about Max, or hospitals, or accidents. They talked about who they were, or maybe who they were becoming. It wasn't a perfect night, but it was real, and sometimes real is better. When they said goodbye, Nathaniel hesitated at her car. "Thank you," he said again. Emily looked up at him. "You've said that a few times now," she teased. He nodded. "I don't think I'll ever stop." She smiled, and for a second, time felt still. "Good," she said softly. "Then don't." Back at home, Nathaniel peeked into Max's room. The boy slept peacefully, one arm across his chest, the other dangling off the side of the bed. On the nightstand, Emily's gold star sticker still shone under the lamp's glow. Nathaniel stood there for a while, watching his son breathe. He thought about the laughter, the dances, the chance he'd almost missed, and for the first time in a long, long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Absolutely. Thank you for the reminder. Israel Jim, Chapter 8. Written with greater continuity. Avoiding overly short or fragmented sentences and maintaining the same emotional tone and narrative rhythm as previous chapters. The seasons shifted quietly. There was no dramatic snowfall or sudden bloom to mark the change. Just subtle signs, a gentler breeze, a longer pause before nightfall, a boy who laughed more easily, and a man who began to measure his days not by meetings, but by moments. Max no longer dreaded hospital visits. They had become something more than medical. The appointments, still important, were wrapped now in the rhythm of stories, games, and familiar faces. And Nathaniel, once a silent presence in the corner, had become a part of it all, asking questions, making jokes, even remembering which therapy bands Max preferred. Emily remained at their side through it all, never intrusive, always exactly where she needed to be. Her care for Max had never faltered, but it had deepened into something more rooted, something layered with history, with shared glances, quiet moments, and an affection that never needed to be spoken aloud. By now, everyone had noticed. It wasn't just the nurses and doctors who paused when they saw the three of them together. It was the janitor who gave Nathaniel a knowing nod, the receptionist who smiled a little wider when Emily walked by, even the volunteers who had started calling Max the Little Prince. No one questioned it, because in their own way, without declarations or decisions, they had become a family. The improvement in Max's physical condition was gradual, but real. The therapy was working. The doctors spoke with cautious optimism. Muscles that had once refused to respond were beginning to twitch. Nerve signals, once silent, had started to whisper. It wasn't a miracle, it was something better, progress. One afternoon, during a routine therapy session, Max managed to shift his foot half an inch without assistance. Just half an inch. But when it happened, the entire room went still. Emily's hands froze on her notepad. Nathaniel leaned forward, his mouth parted slightly in disbelief. And Max, wide-eyed, looked down at his own leg like it belonged to someone else. "I felt it," he whispered. "I really did." Nathaniel stepped closer, crouched beside him, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Max," he said, his voice catching in his throat. "So proud." Emily turned away, blinking fast. After the session, they didn't celebrate with balloons or noise. Instead, they stopped at a small cafe near the hospital, sat at a quiet table by the window, and shared a single slice of chocolate, cake, forks scraping gently against the plate as they took turns and talked about everything but the hospital. It was simple and perfect. Days turned into weeks, and the hospital visits began to spread out. Max didn't need to come in as often. His home therapy was going well, and Nathaniel had started joining in, following instructions, asking Emily for guidance over video calls when she wasn't there in person. Their messages had become a daily habit. Sometimes brief updates, sometimes long, winding texts about memories, fears, hopes, sometimes just a shared photo, a sunset, a page from a book, a drawing Max had made. One afternoon, while walking through the park, Nathaniel pushed Max's wheelchair slowly along the path. Emily walked on the other side, occasionally kicking, a pine cone out of the way, the soft rustle of leaves under their steps, setting a quiet rhythm. They didn't need to fill the air with chatter. The silence between them had become something sacred, comforting, familiar, a language of its own. Max leaned back, letting the breeze hit his face. "Dad," he said after a while, "do you remember when I asked you to dance with me?" Nathaniel smiled. "Of course I do." "I think that was the day everything changed," Max said simply. "For all of us." Nathaniel looked at Emily, who gave a quiet nod, her eyes warm. "Me too," she said. They continued walking. At one point, Nathaniel stopped. They were near the lake, the water still and silver beneath the afternoon sky. Ducks drifted in the distance. Children played further off, their laughter bouncing gently on the breeze. Nathaniel turned to Max and knelt beside the wheelchair. He looked up at his son, brushing a strand of hair from the boy's forehead, then rested his hand on the armrest. "Thank you," he said softly. Max tilted his head. "For what?" "For teaching me how to be your dad again." Max's smile was wide, unguarded, full of light. Then Nathaniel turned to Emily. He stood slowly, stepped toward her, and for a moment just stood there, quiet, thoughtful. "You were right," he said. "All I had to do was show up." Emily looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "You did more than that." Nathaniel nodded. "Still, I want you to know something. From the first time you made him laugh, I've watched you do what I was too afraid to do. You reached him, and somehow you reached me too." Emily lowered her eyes, her throat tightening. Nathaniel continued, "You didn't just help us. You saved us." There was nothing grand in the way he said it. No music, no performance, just truth, spoken plainly, finally allowed to breathe. Emily stepped forward and reached for his hand. He took it, and in that moment, beneath a sky that had once felt endlessly heavy, the three of them stood together. No longer a man, a boy, and a nurse, but a father, a son, and someone who had quietly become the bridge between who they were and who they were becoming. Later that evening, as Max lay in bed drawing spaceships and stars, Nathaniel and Emily sat quietly on the balcony outside, 2 cups of tea between them, the city humming softly below. They didn't talk about the past that night. They didn't need to. Instead, they talked about tomorrow, about museums they hadn't visited, about parks with trails wide enough for Max's chair, about pancakes on Saturday mornings and the possibility of getting a dog. None of it felt forced, because none of it was. And when the stars finally came out, scattered like tiny promises across the sky, Nathaniel turned to her and whispered, "You him feel like home." Emily smiled, her fingers tightening around his. "So do you," she said. Inside, Max turned off his light and looked at the ceiling, his gold star sticker still shining faintly on the bedpost. He didn't wish for anything that night, because for the first time in a long time, he didn't have to.